Well, thank you again for joining us. I'm Amanda Davison-Young. I'm the CEO of the Tablet, and we're delighted for those to join us live and those on the recording who will be with us for this hour's webinar. Today, we're absolutely delighted to have the University of Notre Dame with us and sponsored by the University of Notre Dame. This webinar will be talking about tending to stories in times of hope. We're going to be joining a thought-provoking webinar exploring how religious imagination can engage with experience to foster equality, justice, and inclusion. And we have an expert panel who will be reflecting on the role of faith in interpretations of art, story, and tradition that highlight women's experiences and build more compassionate creative spaces. As we run through the webinar, if you've got any questions on the topic or any questions for the panel, then please do put them in the chat box. And without further ado, I shall hand over to Renee. Good morning to you, Renee, or good afternoon to you, or good evening.
Good morning. Good
Although
morning.
for all of us. Good to see you.
Thank you, Amanda. Lovely to be here, and I'm delighted to be working with the Tablet on behalf of the University of Notre Dame, Australia, for what I know will be a very stimulating discussion. So I just take a moment to introduce the webinar and also to introduce our panelists. In this year of the Jubilee of Hope, this webinar brings together a group of female scholars who reflect on the role of faith in interpretations of art, story, and tradition. Their work takes as its beginning point women's experiences. Their goal, to build more compassionate, creative spaces. So let me introduce you to our panelists. First of all, Katharine Massam is Professor of History and Chair of the Academic Board at the University of Divinity, Australia. Her publications include A Bridge Between Benedictine Missionary Women in Australia, and this was shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's Award in Australian History in 2021. She's also published Sacred Threads, Catholic Spirituality in Australia, 1922 to 1962, and that was published in 1966. And most recently, The Promise and the Blessing, Presentation Sisters in Victoria since Vatican II, published just this year. Katharine's work reflects long-standing research interests in cross-cultural encounter and the lived experience of faith and belief, particularly viewed through the lens of feminist theory and monastic theology. So a wonderful combination. Thank you, Katharine, for being here. Rebekah Pryor joins us from the University of Melbourne and is an artist and academic at the University of Divinity, Australia. I'm sorry, she received her PhD at the University of Melbourne and is with us from the University of Divinity in Australia. Rebekah is also a member of the Australian Collaborators in Feminist Theologies Incorporated. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on embodiment and how this is constructed, performed, represented, and renegotiated in material cultures and communities of belief. Rebekah's publications include Motherly, Reimagining the Maternal Body in Feminist Theology and Contemporary Art, published in 2022, also Feminist Theologies, Interstices and Fractures, co-edited with Stephen Burns, published in 2023, and Contemporary Feminist Theologies, Power, Authority, Love, co-edited with Kerry Handeside and Catherine McKinney, published by Routledge in 2021. And finally, Helena, my own colleague, is a lecturer in English literature at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, based in Fremantle on Whadjuk country, and she is a writer of short fiction and non-fiction. She's interested in diverse methodologies for engaging deeply in literature, and thus works with traditional scholarship, as well as storytelling and creative writing, to pursue research methods in women's relational identity, precarity, and motherhood. Recent work also extends these themes to attitudes towards the earth, home, and sustainability. So as you hear, we have a wonderful panel here with us today, and we very much look forward to the conversation. So those participants this evening who want to delve even deeper into this work and this approach, which will be presented this evening, should keep an eye out, I should say, for the upcoming publication of the book that brings their work together in scholarship, together with the scholarship of a number of others. So Helena and Katharine have edited a book entitled Tending to Stories in Feminist Theologies, Interdisciplinary Renderings of Faith, Hope, and Love, which will be published by Routledge in a few months' time. So there's the first spruik of the book, and I hope there'll be a few more. In fact, this panel came about because of a chance conversation between Helena and I at the graduation ceremony for the School of Arts and Sciences in Fremantle, where she told me about the project, and I just thought it was wonderful. So this panel really grew out of this and our long-standing engagement and partnership with the tablet. So the book engages in an interdisciplinary quest for meaning by engaging in the work of religious imagination. So I'd like to start there if we could. Helena, could I ask you, what do we mean when we say religious imagination? What is that?
Thank you, Renee. And just firstly, I just want to thank you and Amanda and the tablet community for having us here tonight. It is really exciting to be here and to be talking with you all. And yes, from Whadjuk country in Perth, Western Australia for me. So thank you. Yeah, religious imagination. One way of thinking about it, the easiest way I like to think about it, is the connection between human creativity and religious sensibilities. So, human beings are multifaceted. So we act and we move in space, we think, we speak, we feel, but we also imagine. And there's no getting around that. It's an integral part of being human. And that imagination causes us to create, and we create a range of things. So when we think about the religious imagination, it can almost be from two different sides of things. It might be an interest in what that product is, what the creativity is, what is produced. And that can mean looking at artworks, for instance, or poetry or song, and exploring the religious sensibilities, the sense of wonder about humanity, about God and the divine, about our connection to creation that we might see in the artwork. But it can also, and this is the part I'm really interested in as a storyteller, it's also about the process. It's seeing the process of imagining itself as an experience of, as a religious experience. I mean, and there's a couple of people that have written quite a bit about this. Andrew Greeley wrote about the Catholic imagination at the beginning of the century, for instance. And he notes, for example, all of the paraphernalia that we see so much in Catholic environments, so churches and schools and institutions, and even like in our own institution at Notre Dame, Australia, the way that kind of statues and rosary beads and artworks and things, and he sees these as a sign of that human inclination to see the holy in the everyday, and to see that in the everyday objects and events and people around us, we seek what's holy, which I think of as being what is it that connects us to each other, to what's beyond each other, and certainly towards creation. So I think that process is very interesting. But I also know that from the place where I stand here in Australia, where we are so lucky to be on the locations of the oldest surviving cultures in the world, that First Nations cultures show us that capacity to create and produce and reflect in artifact our spiritual sensibilities are very, very ancient. So they predate modern religion, that, God has been with us forever. And we certainly see that in so much Indigenous art. So I guess to finish my beginning, you said spruik the book. I will mention one of our authors in Tending to Stories, Jennifer Rumble, who's a Gamilaroi woman and also describes herself as a cradle Catholic. She writes about this idea of the First Nations canon of stories. And she says that I'll just read this one snippet. She says, "We all have stories that ground us and offer us a sense of belonging and comfort in times of dislocation. For First Nations people, stories are a means of preserving knowledge and wisdom. They are sacred canons which provide education, history, environmental knowledge, and familial connection." And then she goes on to talk about how that canon is hidden in plain sight in the modern world, and that for the settler eyes, we don't often see it. So I think that that is an important work for us here in Australia, is learning how we might understand the sacredness of that storytelling, that imagining, that articulation. And if we understand that it's sacred work, then we understand the gift in receiving it. And that kind of process of creating and receiving and sharing is something I'm really interested in.
Helena, it almost sounds like you're talking about grace in a different kind of way. That's
I'm
beautiful.
definitely talking about grace. I hope to get to that later too.
Okay,
Absolutely.
good. All right. All right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll stay tuned for that. Rebekah and Katharine, could I ask you, would you like to add anything on religious imagination? Rebekah, I can see you nodding. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah. Again, thank you for having us. I would underline some of the things that Helena's already offered there in that opening statement, particularly this idea that imagination is entirely grounded in the real, in the everyday. And so whether that's materialized in visual art or formed by the language of poetry and story, for example, or remaining just in the mind, only as a sense of things in relation, images and our recognition and play with those, I think occupies an important role in how we be in the world, including in relation to others, how we process that experience. So then it makes sense that the religious imagination is that affective experience that emerges out of personal and collective experiences of belief. And I would say that this is a really powerful resource not to be underestimated. And certainly kind of the history of the church indicates that the image is particularly put to work in service of a political agenda, as well as a devotional one. And maybe that then shifts that idea of imagination into the imaginary, where it becomes a thing that's put to work in service, perhaps as an effective political kind of mechanism. And there's some good scholarship around this. There's one philosopher whose work I appreciate, Marie-José Monzan, who writes about the image economy and how this in the Byzantine Church was particularly strategically worked as a way of kind of shoring up some doctrinal commitments, but this distinction between the image and the icon was made. And that was a kind of clever move on the part of the church, and one that brought about about spiritual and political transformation, good or bad. That's another conversation perhaps. The image and the imagination, and then the imaginary, all distinct, powerful things that we have access to.
Thanks, Rebekah. I think together we're building up a vocabulary already that we can tease out a little bit over the next hour. Image, imaginary, imagination. Thank you. Katharine, is there anything you'd like to add?
I agree with all that. I think religious imagination works in that space between the literal and the purely personal or the idiosyncratic. So as Helena and Rebekah have said, we're in the realm of symbol and metaphor where meaning happens, as Sandra Schneiders would say. Religious imagination is what gives us the parables. The reign of God is like yeast in the dough. The reign of God is like a woman looking for a coin. It's like or it's the midrash that elaborates on ancient texts. So it's a process of translation where we're reaching into where language starts to fall away. In Marilyn Robinson's novel Home, there's a moment where the theological task is described as parsing the broken heart of humankind and praising the loving heart of Christ. And I think that dialogue is exactly the dialogue of religious imagination. It's it's in that space between realities and the symbols and metaphors that we use to communicate one to the other. I think it's a really strong concept, and it's been great working with people in the book who've explored it from different angles. So there.
Thank you, Katharine. So I'm hearing a lot about the everyday, the real, the material, something that happens in our everyday lives, very much grounded in experience. And I wonder, Rebekah, if I could ask you about that starting point of the project, which is experience, but specifically women's experience, because this is the work of feminist theology, and it's taking women's experience as a starting point. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why it is specifically that women's experience provides such a rich starting point for thinking about and exploring the religious imagination.
Thanks, Renee. This is such an interesting question and thing to think on, women's experience, this category. And of course, my feminist instincts urge me to avoid approaching something like women's experience as a uniform or homogenous category. Because, of course, that would be to kind of gloss over or ignore somehow our difference and our uniqueness. But also to forget, and there's some good scholarship around this, to forget that sex and gender and sexuality are concepts and that, of course, are useful to us, but that we as societies build on to frame real and embodied experience. So I guess that's a disclaimer to then thinking about that rich starting point, which I think I would rather talk about in terms of embodied experience. And the women's liberation movement and waves of feminism since have kept embodied experience front and center, I think, of personal and collective imagination, including in the area of feminist theologies where that continues to be primary. So I think in patriarchal traditions that have formed many of our religious places and theologies and doctrines, where some of those ideas about the body and the mind, where these things have been separated out, and the effect has been to kind of diminish the body in bodies in particular ways. And of course, that legacy persists even now in churches, but also beyond the church, more broadly in Western cultural contexts. That to do theology from or with the body, and I'm made to think of that phrase, to do theology indecently, from Marcella Altus Reed. That still feels radical in this kind of context. And as such, I think it's such a rich starting point for imaginative thinking and practice for us, certainly in feminist theologies.
Thanks so much, Rebekah. And I wonder if I might open it up to all of you actually to ask how it is that the experience that you've just described might have implications, the implications that I think have been drawn out in the book that I'm looking forward to reading. I've seen the table of contents, so I'm very, very intrigued. How is it that women's experience in the ways that you've described it, with all of the caveats, which are very important, Rebekah, how does this have implications for how we make what you call collectively a compassionate and creative space? So I don't know who'd like to maybe respond to that first. Helena?
Maybe I'll jump in, Katharine, because then you might finish off a little bit with the work, I suppose. But I was thinking in terms of that sense of creating space. And, you know, I'm an old-fashioned feminist in some ways. Sometimes I enjoy falling back onto some essentializing, and then the contemporary feminist in me rejects all of that. But I think that, you know, obviously I don't think that there's anything biologically essential about women that lead them to look perhaps for inclusiveness or to seek justice or to bring others along with them. And there's no experience of being a woman that is the same for everybody. But I think that there's certainly been historical and current precedent enough that in many ways and for many women, Two social determinants result in them being positioned perhaps to think in that way. And that's, I think, often being the primary carers for more people. Mini communities, if you like, even if it's their only children or their immediate families or parents, sometimes broader, sometimes women take the bulk of care in their workplaces and amongst their colleagues, for example. So that conditioning and also necessity to think of others and to take others with them on a journey, but also because of historically often being positioned out of the centre and having perhaps less access to power, to wealth. And so those kind of dual conditions, I think, where you can't just sort of jump ahead on your own. You've got to bring a few others with you, and you're trying to get a bit closer to some resources, I think kind of means that women's experiences often are leaning towards that creating space and seeking to bring others towards equality, equity, and justice. And of course, many men and other genders are doing this as well. But I think that it just means it's so important then to look at the experiences of of all the full expressions of humanity. And it's so important to see the experiences there as they're expressed in art, in poetry, in song, in performance, in dance, in sculpture, to see what we can learn from that. And I think that I won't talk too much about the book you may be planning to, Katharine, but I think in what we've tried to do in this book is to model that sense of inclusivity. We're scholars ourselves, but we wanted to create a space to bring others into the conversation about tending to stories and to privilege poetry and visual artwork and critical reflection and storytelling alongside traditional scholarship is a way of creating a more mutual space that's built on understanding these different ways of finding meaning and expressing experience.
I think I'd pick up on the experience there, Helena, and say, oh, sorry, Renee, did you have a question you were going to throw in?
No, I was just going to say over to you, but I was on mute, so there you go.
Okay. So the place of experience in all theologies of liberation, feminist and womanist included, seems to me something that's come through really clearly in each of the chapters of this collection, one way or the other. So there are people reflecting on stories that they've heard others tell them, on their own experience, on historic and scriptural instances, and the way in which people weave reflections on that into a new narrative or a new artwork or a new liturgy has been part of what it's been a real privilege to watch. There's one example that I thought I might tell just briefly about a parish in outer suburban Melbourne in the 1970s that was being established from the ground up. And there was a diocesan task force appointed to work with this community. There was a parish priest, and the task force was of teaching sisters, nuns. Traditionally, they would have been appointed to the school, but there was no school. They were appointed to do parish work. And one of the sisters in particular, Nance Morgan, drew women together, realised that a lot of the young mothers with young children were very isolated. And so she instigated coffee mornings and heard more stories. And out of that experience, it wasn't just tea and sympathy, but a project emerged where they established a childcare co-op where they would roster one of the women to look after several groups of children, and the children were free to play, and the women who were not rostered were free to have some spare time, have some free time. So they called it the Freedom Club, and that's still going as an outreach in that parish decades later. And when the parish buildings were commissioned, it was the Freedom Club and that structure that had priority. Out of a very strong vision of the church as people of God, they worked with a woman architect who had some great designs to convert domestic houses into a childcare centre. Went on to win awards for it, and this listening attentively to story and thinking about theological concepts related to human dignity and the church as the people of God led to this physical structure for creativity and dignity, and then any number of other graced effects that might have flowed from that. And the book is full of those sorts of instances where tiny examples start to flourish when people do the theological work together.
Thank you, Katharine, and that great link between freedom and actually having the time to think theologically and to come together creatively. That's I think already a wonderful way to understand what some of the contributions are. Rebekah, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I love this motif of space that's emerging here in this conversation. And of course, it was in the blurb for the event, so I'm glad we're still talking about it. But this turn to a kind of architecture is useful, I think. And there's some really great philosophy around the interval that we can make between us, and on the understanding that we're irreducible to each other, that actually I can't be fully known by you, you can't be fully known by me, that when we come together, we kind of hold a space, we make a space for ourselves to meet, and that this is really creative and potentially compassionate gesture. And I think it's a hospitable place because it's not that's not at all contingent on the kind of denial of the self. It's a kind of self-respecting space, and it's a space that welcomes the other into a kind of relation. And Katharine's reference to architecture brings me much joy. In part of my work is as an artist, and I actually noticed that a fellow artist and author of a chapter in our book, Dr. Libby Byrne, is present tonight, and you can Google her and find her work, her artwork. But in my practice, I'm really interested in space and this idea of kind of the interval, the space we can make for ourselves and each other. And this led me a number of years back to create an installation work in St. Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne, where I, using the architectural drawings of the building from way back, drawn originally by William Butterfield, I used those to construct a portable cathedral based on using the philosophy of Luce Irigaray, this idea of kind of a breathable building, an open-ended structure. And part of this was a kind of way of shouting something at a feeling or responding to in myself a feeling of displacement, where I needed to think about space and a space for myself. I needed to make a space for myself. And as it happened, I managed to negotiate to put that portable cathedral inside the actual cathedral. But importantly, that portable cathedral, which is now, of course, in a cupboard in the studio, never to probably be seen again in real life. Maybe I'll get it out one time. But that was made and came from ordinary life for me. And in fact, I made it inside my house with its kind of conventional standard roof height. So it could only be as tall as my ceiling because I couldn't fit it in the house otherwise. So it had these kind of limits that kept it everyday size. And so it kind of did something theologically for me that was helpful to think through about not only space, but about this kind of relation between myself and my community and myself and the divine, and this whole tradition that had formed me that I was then able to think critically with and about. So this idea of space is really useful to us, I think.
Yeah, and it's more than a metaphor in the way that you're speaking about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's something lived and real, and but it keeps developing and growing, and therein lies some of the creativity, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I mean, this is the attraction to this idea of portability is a kind of response to that. It's provisional. You can take it down. You can reimagine it. It's still kind of got the makings of a structure, but it's able to have a bit of flexibility about it that feels important, useful, relational, responsive as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Rebekah. I wanted to ask Katharine, because you deal so much with narrative in your own work of feminist theology, and you work in that space of feminist theology and monasticism, I want to ask you this question first. So how important is narrative, or how is narrative important for informing imagination, but also practice?
Mm.
So, in
Mm.
other words, how is it that stories help us to live out religious experience and imagination? And you gave us a wonderful example before, so I'm wondering if you might have another one that you could share with us as well.
I think so, yes.
I thought you
One
might.
of the things, one of the things that people notice about monastic theology is exactly what you've put your finger on. How often it starts with a story, with an
Mm,
example from someone's life. Other forms of theology might offer a definition or uh, point to an argument, but monastic writers tend all the time towards narrative. It's a generalization. But I think if you think of the sayings of the desert, for example, so
yeah.
back in the 4th century in Egypt, um, there's hardly a proposition amongst it all, but there are lots of examples where someone does something very specific or says something very specific in response to particular circumstances. Um, and that they are in themselves little vignettes, tiny stories that invite people into, well, reflection on experience and the telling of more stories. For example, um, there's a story of Ama Theodora, and someone came to see her because she was having a hard time with great temptations. And Theodora advised her to have a conversation with the temptations, to have a conversation. So
Mm,
the inquirer said, right, I'll do this as if they were demons. And sure, she did that then and there. And she asked the temptations, what would it take for you to leave alone? Fasting maybe. And the temptations say, no, no, we don't eat or drink. Or maybe keeping vigil, would you leave me alone? No, 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 we don't sleep. So what conquers you? And the temptations say, oh, only humility. And then Ama Theodora chimes in the story and says, see, it's nothing you can do. It's an inner disposition. It's humility. That's the
mm,
cure. It's a work of grace. So the whole teaching package, the whole theological package is given to us in the form of a drama, a story. And it's it's very memorable and accessible because of that. And there are plenty of examples through the centuries of that kind of this similar enshrining of the place of theological reflection on experience. Women who saw the need for childcare, education that would equip women with professional skills, people in workplaces who saw that if they got to know each other better, they'd support each other better. Um, but maybe we can let Theodora from the 4th century stand for all of that. That there's a way in which um, theological teaching packages wrapped up as drama
mm,
stand the test of time. That story communicates in ways that propositions don't
mhm,
necessarily.
mhm. Yeah, Eleanor Stump did a lot of work with this idea as well, the idea of the narrative. Yeah, which I always found quite fascinating. Her example was that with Saint Dominic or with the Dominicans, they're people of argument, whereas the Franciscans, if ever you want to know about Francis, what you get back is a story. So with the Dominican, you get an
Yeah.
argument. With Saint Francis, you get a story. And I thought that was an intriguing way of looking into everything. But there's something that a narrative tells us that you can't find in any other kind of
Yes.
propositional way. Um,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
from what
Well,
I
Francis, you
understand,
get a metaphor, actually.
you get what? Sorry, you get metaphor as well.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You get a metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Sorry, there was a little bit of a lag there. Sorry, Catherine.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and the metaphor then brings us into the space of creativity and art and imagination in different ways as well. Um, I wonder if I could turn to that. I'm just keeping an eye on the time because we do want to make sure that we've got some time for questions, and I've got at least one that's come in that I'll take over to you. So Catherine, Helena, Rebecca, I wonder if I could ask you all, and I won't start with you, Catherine, because I've already gotten a couple of examples from you, but if I
I
could
know.
have I know, it's wonderful. Um, so could you come up with or give us an example of something that we might find in your book, perhaps, or elsewhere, where a woman's work of art, imagination, and tradition, specifically by engaging with faith, moves toward justice and inclusion? Because this was part of how we talked about when we were putting this webinar together, that these themes come through. So imagination, creativity, art, sometimes they can seem like they're quite self-serving. We have this idea of the genius of the artist, who's someone who turns away from the world and goes off and does usually his own thing. But how is it that what you're exploring through feminist theology and experience and religious imagination actually leads towards works that feed us and that inspire us and create zones of justice and inclusion? I wonder if you might have an example to kind of get our heads around that because it's quite difficult and maybe even counterintuitive in some ways. Helena, could I ask you first?
Sure, thanks, Renee. Yeah, look, there are lots of examples. I mean, you know what I'm going to do though? I'm going to start with one of the men who walk away and go off and do his own thing. Because as a literary scholar, I really do come back to James Joyce on this a bit. So the Irish kind of modernist writer and the great, the elite artist. Because at the end of his semi-autobiographical novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he finishes with the idea of his character realizing he has a vocation to be an artist
Mm.
and what then the implications that will mean. And he gives it to us in such beautiful poetic language. And his character says that he will become a priest of eternal imagination, transmuting the daily bread of experience into the radiant body of everlasting life. And of course, he's drawing there on his Catholic traditions and Catholic imagery. But I love the poetry of it and I love the essence of it. And I see it again all around me. And one of the strongest influences for me in my own work using story to bring about, to reach a point of grace, and I said I would come back to grace with you, is reading some of the work of Elizabeth Ersick, as an American academic who's written on women and women's art and theology and feminist theology. And she says very, very similar things to what Joyce said. She writes that great theology, like great art, speaks directly to the needs, hopes, and desires of the community by revealing a deeper wisdom, and that theology, like art, requires imagination. And one of the things that she talks about is theological imaginizing, which is the idea of using art and the imagination intentionally to do the theological work. And that I had a direct experience of that myself when I was writing stories about my father. And I've published several stories about my relationship with him. But one in particular was I wrote this shortly after he died, because just before he died, an image of his clothing really caught in my imagination. And it grabbed me so hard that it was almost very difficult for me to tell quite a close friend about it. But I said to her then, I know I'm going to write about this. And I didn't yet know at that point what it would be about. And then I went, and eventually there was enough space to write the story of this item of my father's clothing as it appeared at different points in my life, right up until that day before he died. And reflecting on that process of writing with Elizabeth Ersk's theology, what I realized was that the writing had brought me to a point of grace, because it enabled me to come to a position where I was able to see that the physical separation between my father and I, after 50 years of relationship, at that point of physical separation, we were one. He left, we parted, and there was nothing left unresolved. There was the greatest sense of both of us being very equal in the eyes of God, both deeply loved by God, that I felt equally forgiven as I felt able to forgive. And it just, everything just dissipated. It was the most profound sense of grace. And I think that obviously, if we could, I mean, clearly, wouldn't that just be wonderful for human beings to continue to arrive at places with each other where difference dissolves, conflict resolves, pain can resolve, and there can be a profound sense of being equal in the eyes of God. And it wasn't reading the Erskine article that brought me to that. It was the writing of the story, writing about that image that I knew I was going to have to write about, that brought me to that place. But Erskine's theology helped me to understand the experience in theological terms.
So a wonderful integration of theory and practice in a way. But what strikes me in listening to all of you is that when we're talking about feminist theology, and this is what I was trying to understand at the beginning, what is it about women's theology, or what is it about feminist theology that actually takes us into this space? And it seems that it's the experience, which is that of embodiment and the everyday, which actually is the most fruitful, rather than the theorizing coming first. It's actually the experience that's coming first. But then you don't do away with the theorizing. Instead, it helps you to develop what's going on with the experience. Does that sound about right? So it's more the particularity than the abstract?
I think so.
Mm.
Yeah, I think so. And all the
Yeah.
examples, I know Rebekah and Katharine will speak, but certainly, I mean, Motherhood and God by the English writer Margaret Hebblethwaite was just so influential to me when I was raising young children, and really following that sense of looking for God in that everyday experience of care. But yes, what about you, Rebekah? Some examples.
Yeah, there are certainly examples of colleagues and fellow artists in the book. So Libby's own chapter called Being Among the Storied Life of Trees, where that meeting is worked out, and Libby can speak to this herself, perhaps in the question time, but that encounter is totally grounded, and there's not a conflation of the difference there, but a kind of being with in the difference that feels really important. For me, the artist who does this art imagination in the context of tradition so well, her work, the artist is Marie Clark, and she doesn't necessarily make work that addresses faith or works from a position of faith, because I don't know that about her, but she's an Melbourne-based artist with ancestral connections to the Muddy Muddy and the Wumba Wumba, Yorta Yorta and Bunwurrung peoples, and I live on Bunwurrung country here. But she's got this work called Ancestral Memory, and it's a kind of glass eel trap that is suspended in space. So it's this really massive piece of work, but it's got these kinds of, instead of being a continuous form, it's really porous. Like it's got gaps between this. It's as if the eel trap has been sliced. So there's lots of points of entry and exit. And it's a work about remembering traditions of First Nations cultures and communities that haven't been lost but have been squashed by colonization and settler presence, and that difficult relation that we still are working through here. The work is really generous, I think. It's beautiful. And so art in combination with imagination tradition does this thing of kind of drawing us in, compelling us, I think, to engage with it. But this particular work presents a huge challenge to participate and respond to. It's a kind of urging to recognise the need for justice, continuing justice for First Nations people. And so while it doesn't necessarily engage Christian faith, it does exemplify how art and imagination and tradition combine, I think, to move us, and I use that word compel, or kind of urge us, demand that we respond in a way that makes for justice and inclusion. I love art that can do that, that it's not nice, it's difficult work. It's really important work. The other piece that comes to mind is actually in the UK. It's by Iranian English artist Hushiari, who made this east window in St. Martin in the Fields. You might know it. It's a window inside a church, and it has this kind of, in the wrought iron of the window, it has this kind of opening, an aperture, like a hole in the middle of what would be the intersection of a cross. And it's as if the space is opened up. So she creates this space that appears to puncture kind of exclusive theological positions, doctrines, dogmas, practices, traditions, and so on. But situated in the center of this window, this cross-like shape that it takes its cue from, her architectural intervention makes a way in and out of experience that wasn't there before. And that is hugely powerful in theological terms, I think. And I can't talk about that work without doing this. Like, actually, it's really, it calls me to make a move in response. Great art does that, I think.
Something has to give way or be pushed away in order for something else to happen, and it's a kind of invitation to enter into that space. That's fantastic. Katharine, would you like to give us another nugget?
I'm thinking in response to what Helena and Rebekah have said about how valuable the First Nations storytelling is for those of us who are not part of the First Nations, that this opens up. And Auntie Betty Pike, who actually kind of bookends the collection. We quote her in the introduction, and we didn't know that Naomi Wolf, First Nations colleague, was going to conclude with another story from Auntie Betty. But she, Auntie Betty's a Noongar woman, was a Noongar woman, and she talks about how when people don't know personally First Nations people, it's the telling of stories, the creation of art, the invitation to enter in that can help people engage with the experience. So it's really good to be reminded of that. I wanted to talk about Pat Cunningham, though, who, this is just my example. So Pat Cunningham is a Sydney woman who went to the dentist in the spring of 1990, and she was shocked when the receptionist asked her for her mother's name, because in her 50 plus years of experience, she had never before, by anyone official, been asked for her mother's name. And she was so shocked that she wrote a letter about this to the journal Women Church, the feminist journal of religion and politics that was then, I think, a few years old in Sydney, reflecting on this, because that experience had made her recall how, as a little girl, she had wanted to convince her father and her brothers that God is not a boy's name. She had whole reflection on how women lose their names, and then she was trying to tell her father as a kid that, God is not a boy's name. And in this letter to the journal, she concludes by saying, what about T-shirts that have this slogan, God is not a boy's name? Can you do that? And Women Church had a resident cartoonist, and so they directed his attention to this. And on the back of the issue, there was a picture of a woman with a T-shirt, "God is not a boy's name." Um, and so that was in the spring of 1990. And that back cover got photocopied and put on office doors and fronts of files. And in 2012, the precursor of our network of Australian collaborators in feminist theology put it on bags and put it on an apron. And there's something about how Pat Cunningham's telling of her story about the dentist, recalling her story as a child, opens up space for, it's a very simple phrase that goes in one way to the heart of so much feminist theology, that, God is not a boy's name. It wraps it up in ways that are telling. So
Yeah.
that's the example that came to mind for
Okay.
me.
I like that very much. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. I'm always looking for a good t-shirt slogan. Thank you, Katharine. We have, I think, a couple of questions. So I might just direct them to all of you, if I may. So one is from Joanna, and she asks, does this issue of embodiment and making a place for oneself link into the role of women generally in the church? So recent theological research on Jesus' women disciples, particularly Mary Magdalene, if we look at the embodied in spiritual terms, in inclusive terms as women, then this must be part of discipleship, surely. So that's one question. And then the other question that I have from the floor is, how can we take the idea of art, imagination, and storytelling to help influence the movement in this new papacy to help women secure leadership positions in the Catholic Church? And do the panel think this will ever happen? So I think good feminist, I'm a philosopher by nature. So political philosophy, when it comes to feminist political philosophy, says that the personal is political. So I think that we're coming into that space now, and perhaps into that space of justice that you've all opened up with that wonderful image of going like this. So what is it that that your explorations might help us to see in order to answer or respond to one or more of those questions? Do you have any thoughts?
Respond
I
to
might,
the making space for oneself as a kind of move of discipleship. If I've understood Joanna's question accurately enough there. I think these traditions in which we're formed, that we come to perhaps, that we love in part, it's difficult when they fail us, exclude us, don't hold space for us in whatever difference we might represent or embody or experience. I think for me, drawing on my experience and with the thinking that I've been doing, that actually making a space for yourself inside a tradition, however you can manage that or on the edge of it, feels sometimes like a kind of way to survive or not ditch the whole thing altogether. And that can be a kind of way of following, a way of discipleship in that is generative, generous, self-respecting. These are feminist principles, I think. So I would say, yes, definitely making a space for yourself, however you can manage that inside a tradition on the edge of it, is a strategy for discipleship, for sure. Helena, you might have something to add there.
I think my response may or may not speak to both, I suppose, people who might be thinking explicitly about, for example, women's ordination in the Catholic Church, and then others who might be thinking it's more about more leadership positions. And because I think it's about everything. And I think that of course change will occur, because change occurs when we do it, when we change and we do something different. My mother, I grew up Catholic. I still consider myself Catholic, even though I've been the partner, the spouse of an Anglican priest for 20 years. And so my full daily identity is in the Anglican Church now. But when I was very young, my mother, in a relatively poor suburb of Perth back in the late 70s, 80s, took herself off and did sort of pastoral training, and her parish priest embraced her as an equal partner in the pastoral work of the church. They had equal sized offices side by side in the presbytery, and she worked full time alongside him for 15 years. And she suffered a great deal in terms of criticism, but she was also greatly loved because she just worked so hard, and the two of them worked very, very hard to care for that parish. But and it was just doing it, I think, her courage just to do it. But I think also, I've noticed, I do think it is about people just do it differently. And I think then the top changes, to be honest. I'm a bit more of that kind of a person. I do understand the idea that it's more about perhaps leadership and leadership roles. But then my Anglican experience has shown me that, because I kind of have traversed the very end, the very beginning of women's ordination in the Anglican Church in Australia. And when I first entered the community of the diocese as a clergy spouse, it was still in the mold where the clergy wives, they mostly were kind of tried to be elevated in a certain way by the diocese as being a bit more special than other lay people for their hard contributions to the parish. But it's changed so vastly since the increase in women priests, because male spouses don't necessarily seek any kind of recognition or necessarily role. In a sense, there's been a lessening, if you like, of that kind of an emphasis, as there's been an equal participation at the level of ordination. And I think that that's really important. I think it's just about, as you said, Rebekah, finding your own authentic way to be in communities that bring you joy. And if being in a community is taking too long to recognize the contribution you want to make or the space you want to be, then the community might not be right. It's not that you're not right. The community might not be right. I think we do what we can for as long as we can.
And that link back to community that you all began with is so important here as well. Katharine, would you like to respond to any of the questions?
I'm intrigued by the question about how does art fit with this? And it takes me to Auntie Betty again, you know, that if you tell the story, you sometimes communicate much more effectively than if you offer the manifesto. You know, it's a way of building relationship. Art and artistic practice and metaphorical ways of communicating, whatever that might be, can connect in ways that are sometimes surprising. There needs to be a certain receptivity on the other end, and some of us like to think about, you know, the difference between banging your head against a wall and going around the back and building the garden, so that one day people will look out and they will see the garden. So I think institutional change is very complicated, but I'm a historian, and one of the things that is really clear is that it's very difficult to accurately predict what's actually going to trigger institutional change. You know, it can be a long, slow process and then really quick. So there's something, as the others have said, there's something about the individual discernment of where it's life-giving in a complicated way to hang in there, and where you need to move to a different, where you need to go around the back and build the garden. But the idea that a body of work that tells the story, or occasions where we tell each other stories, you know, over coffee, that these are also powerful mechanisms for political action.
Yeah,
I think is something that it comes through the tradition really clearly.
Thank you. Amanda, I'd like to go on for at least 3 more hours, but I think that we've actually run out of time, so I might have to hand back to you. But first of all, I'd love to thank the panelists here because this has been an extremely invigorating discussion. I've been sketching down things to read, questions to ask, etc. So I may just come back to all of you in different ways over time. But I really appreciate the generosity of all of your responses. Thank you, Amanda. I'll hand back to you now, though, reticently.
So much, Renee.
Well, thank you. Some wonderful imagery in there, and I particularly was taken by Helena's conversation about that item of clothing of her dad's. I guess we've got to read the book to fathom out which item of clothing that was. And I
Just a
love
story.
just a story. Well, we'll get the story, and Katharina's idea of you can keep banging your head against that brick wall, but you build the garden in the background, and then that will show exactly where the future lies. And at the end of the day, it's all about hope, isn't it? So thank you so much. Thank you. It was really, really illuminating, and it was very lovely to meet all of you and to work with you on this project. Thank you again to the University of Notre Dame, Australia, for sponsoring this particular webinar. We do have our one-day conference coming up. So that's the Tablet one-day conference, Leadership in the Church. It will be held at Boreham House over at Chelmsford. So if you're interested in spending a day with the Tablet and some fantastic people, some really, really, of the moment theologians who'll be attending that, then please do get a ticket for that one. It would be wonderful to spend some time with all of you. On behalf of myself and the rest of the Tablet team, again, we'd just like to thank our speakers. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on some webinars in the future. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise. Bye.